anachronistic legal structures, we can be bound by them. If we want to hide behind them, we will. If we want to find solutions, we may just have to change legal structures in a pragmatic fashion. The instruments that have been created with good intention, the so-called ESFS and the ESM, are not as flexible as they need to be, so that they can also purchase directly, if necessary, government debt in the secondary markets. There is an important role for the ECB here, in my view, and I think the time is coming, and it may need to be very, very soon, when the ECB plays a much more active role in liquidity support, and I would say in also adjusting the overall stance of monetary policy for the eurozone as a whole. Right now, the ECB has a monetary policy which may be suitable for a few countries in Northern Europe, but which is hardly accommodated to the realities of sluggish growth in most of Europe. I mean, Europe is on the verge of a recession, let's be frank about it. And policymakers seem somewhat detached from the realities of the marketplace and the realities surrounding extraordinarily high levels of unemployment. I think your unemployment rate here remains below 10%. You look throughout Southern Europe and the numbers are horrifying and grotesque. 15, 20, 25%. And this is not going to change anytime soon. This brings me to another point, which is the obsessive focus on short-term budget cutting. Of course, fiscal discipline is important, but it cannot be achieved by simply requiring the economies of Spain and Greece to dig a bigger hole by cutting spending and raising taxes in the short run, finding out that as a result the economy weakens, the budget gap widens, so you dig a further hole to impose even higher taxes and cut spending even further, and you engage in a vicious cycle which accomplishes nothing but undermining growth prospects and future debt sustainability. This is what has happened in Greece. It is what is beginning to happen in Spain. And this cycle must be adjusted. In my view, the eurozone should focus on medium-term fiscal discipline, not short-term. And it should focus on the structural problems which are at the heart of Europe's economic problem. Bloated welfare systems, excessive presence of the state. Look at the privatization which President Klause and others, with great resistance at the time, implemented here some 20+ years ago. Privatization has been a reality in some of the eurozone countries, but it's time to launch another wave of privatization. As my colleague Jeff Anderson said recently as we were leaving Dublin, and we saw in the morning press about the Portuguese putting their airline for sale, Jeff said, what about Aer Lingus? And I think it's a fair question, what about Aer Lingus? But it's a symbolic question. If you look at the state holdings of enterprise and real estate throughout the eurozone, it is still weighing on the entrepreneurial dynamism of these economies. If you look at the scale of the public sector, in Greece, in Italy, if you look at the social safety net, well-intended as it has been, and some would argue that the creation of Europe's social safety net is one of the grand achievements of the European Union. Whatever it may have been in the past, it is now an increasingly an impractical burden. Why is the unemployment rate so high? Surely it is partly a lack of demand, but it is also partly a function of the difficulties which an unemployed man or woman have in seeking employment if they are to concomitantly, simultaneously give up very, very substantial unemployment benefits. It is a trap, and unfortunately one feels and sees it in Spain today, in Italy today, in Ireland today. The Italian government made great fanfare recently of proposing labor reforms which would reduce from some 40 weeks, I think, to some 27 weeks, the obligation of an employer if he lets someone go for economic reasons. What small firm can afford to let an employee go and pay that employee for another 27 weeks? This was declared a victory. It is far, far short of a victory. In my view, these structural problems, which weigh heavily on the Western European democracies and frankly weigh heavily on the United States as well, will have to be faced if we are to avoid not conflict necessarily among nations, but intergenerational conflict. Because the generation that many of us in this room represent is asking the next generation in many of our countries to pay a greater burden to support the older generation while at the same time providing less job opportunities. That's a recipe for social strife and tumult. Now, can Europe address some of these issues while at the same time launching a compelling move towards some degree of fiscal and political union? This may not be a course which all countries favor, and certainly when you look at the experience of a country like the Czech Republic, embedded in some of the bureaucratic morass and now the economic morass of the European Union, one can understand the caution with which many approach some degree of fiscal and political union. But if there is a way forward, I suspect it is that way. Without this, it seems to me, the likelihood of a fragmentation of the euro and a breakup of the eurozone is quite high. We will all have to see, look, and hope that the leaders meeting in Brussels in the days ahead are up to the challenge, because if they are not, I'm afraid the markets will let us know right away. And this will also require a willingness to integrate supervision, regulation, and resolution of banking systems, in my view. Today we live in a world of growing nationalism and fragmentation, and I don't think it is a recipe for long-term growth. I think that Europe will have to decide, as will the United States, that they're prepared to support a more interdependent world economy, a more integrated world economy, or we will have to turn back. A final few words on the U.S. economy, because we are struggling as well. I don't really spend a great deal of time there, so I don't speak from much first-hand knowledge, but it's evident from the statistics, and evident when you talk to European, to American bankers, businessmen, that the U.S. economy is sputtering. Yes, part of this is a reflection of the weakness of Europe, but part of it is a reflection that we have not been able to revive growth. The policies of President Obama, in my view, have been seriously misguided in a number of respects. The housing market remains extraordinarily weak. And unfortunately, the stimulus, which has placed the U.S. on a rather difficult deficit course and debt course, has accomplished very little. We are facing an election, but we're also facing a time of reckoning. And in my view, the market sentiment, which is now so heavily focused on Europe, can easily swing its focus, its barrels, its anxieties across the Atlantic as quickly or more quickly than you can send an email to a friend or a colleague in New York or Chicago. And when that happens, all of us will pay the price if U.S. officials do not get ahead of the curve. With those rather wide-ranging thoughts and perhaps a few semi-controversial thoughts, it's a real pleasure again for me to be here with you. I would be delighted under your guidance, Mr. President, to engage in a discussion of the issues now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. You gave us a lot to discuss. Well, I am afraid that you will not be surprised that we would have probably many disagreements. What you were saying, really, absolutely basic disagreements, because it seems to me that your, to quote, to conceivable way forward, as you put it at the beginning, is based on some ideas which are not acceptable for us. It's based on a very American idea that we in Europe somehow live in a vacuum where there are no people, no interests, and that we are absolutely free as playing chess on a chessboard. We are absolutely free to make any decision which would be rational. Definitely this is not true. We have to deal with people, we have to deal with their interests, we have to deal with their prejudices, and so on. And this is really not possible. You repeated many times that Europe must make a decision. I think that we would argue here that Europe is not an entity. Europe is not a decision maker. The decision must be made by people. And again, people maximize something given their conditions. So I think it's a real problem. You speak very easily about a correct decision to give money to Spain. But the decision makers or the politicians in Brussels, they are not using their own money to send to Brussels. They are using our money, they are using the taxpayers' money, and we don't want to send those money to Spain and similar countries. So those speak so easily that it's a correct decision. I think it's an absolutely incorrect decision, because it seems to me that you ask how to correct the mistakes of the past by making new mistakes. To send 1 crown or one euro to Spain, Greece, and so on is a terrible mistake. It blocks any rational and reasonable solution. And I must tell you that we experienced the split of a currency. We experienced the termination of a currency, a monetary union in the former Czechoslovakia. So we are not so much afraid of eliminating the monetary union or letting several countries to leave the monetary union. For us, the only way forward, conceivable way forward, is letting Greece to go out of the eurozone. To keep them there is punishing them again. It's a terrible punishment, and the Greeks are victims of that, of entering the eurozone. So I agree with you fully that it's not about as you started, it's not about the Greek people. It's about the system and the leadership, and let's say that you would call it inefficiency of Greece. I would say the given efficiency in Greece. And we economists usually accept the level of efficiency as something given. And we can't change it by our preaching to them anything. So I wouldn't criticize the inefficiency of the Greek society and economy. I would criticize the decision to let Greeks enter the eurozone, and we have to ask who made such a crazy, absolutely wrong decision. The Greeks? I would say only partially. It was made by the Eurocrats, by the Euro naivists and Euro optimists who simply expected that this is excellent for Greece or for anyone in Europe. So for us, really we look at it, I have to say, very, very differently. Totally, almost, absolutely. I don't want to misuse my time to comment on many other things. You speak about the dysfunctionality of European decision-making, or Eurozone decision-making. Is it really a question of decision-making? Isn't it the reflection of the fact that there are contradictory interests in Europe, and this is not the dysfunctionality of decision-making? There is no God who could mastermind Europe from above by making purely rational solutions. We don't live in such a world. We lived in such a world in communism, when there was an assumption that there is someone very clever who is ready to make decisions on our behalf. You know. So we would really expect some other solution to do, but that's almost a co-speech, so which I didn't want to do. Do you want to reflect, or let's take 3-4 questions from the audience? Yeah, very good. Professor Tomšík.
Vladimír Tomšík, National Bank. Mr. Dallara, thank you very much for a definitely interesting speech, and I would really agree on some points that you made. For example, the euro was structurally flawed, you said, or for example, that what we can expect for the future, we can expect long stagnation for the future for the whole European Union. And definitely I agree that probably that we are doing wrong, but that at the same time we put new regulation on the banking system, but at the same time we want them to provide new loans, new credits. This is what I absolutely agree. But on the other hand, there are a lot of things that I would disagree, and I would like to comment on that. You said, for example, at the beginning it was said that maybe people are blind, but definitely market is not blind. Market knows what's the future of that. And your speech was, what's the way forward? And you presented finally, please inject some capital into bank from European funds. Well, it is that we just buy time for that. This is not a way forward. And for example, you said that European leaders will solve the problem. Again, we are buying just time. So why I'm saying that, because I remember your latest speech that you delivered here, it was exactly 1 year ago. And it was again about the banking system. And you said there is only one way. We have to come back to the basics. And what you propose today, as I said, inject new capital and let, for example, let the leaders solve the problem. This is not back forward. This is not a way forward. We should really come back and let national supervisory authorities to design their own banking system, and ask taxpayers what they want to do with their banking system. This is my comment on that.
Thank you very much. Our neighbor, Madam.
Mr. Dallara, thank you so much for your most interesting lecture. There could be hundreds of questions that I would like to ask, but unfortunately I have to limit myself to one or maybe two. First, as a central banker, I would like to ask about monetary policy. Regarding the ultra-low interest rates all over the developed world and various kinds of quantitative easing or non-conventional monetary policy in the US, Japan, United Kingdom, and now also in the eurozone. There is a mainstream opinion that in current subdued demand environment, the inflationary risks are negligible. But on the other hand, there are economists, there are some papers, there is some literature telling us that that those inflationary risks are underestimated or played down in mid-term horizon. And me personally, I'm really worried about this, so I would be interested about your position on that.
So, who has another question?
I run CEP and I was present at the time when the Senate and the Czech Parliament voted for the ESM, not a treaty because we are not a member of eurozone, but there was this article 136 which allows the creation of ESM mechanism in Europe, and it's right now under the ratification process by Mr. President Klause, and if he doesn't ratify this
On my desk,
it's right. And I was present during this process in Senate and in Parliament, and I was asking the people who are voting for it if they know what are they voting for, and there was almost nobody informed what they are doing. Even the finance minister had no clue how much money is actually ESM, and we are in the position where we couldn't afford to pay such a guarantee or those millions of Czech crowns to the stability mechanism. The only way how we could do it is to pay it by our reserves. But the rest of the eurozone is much worse off. There, now today, Italy is going to save Spain, but Italy has 7% as a rate, and they are subsidizing them with 3%. Spain. So I think the situation in Europe is much worse than it looks like. And the ESM will never work because there are no funds ready for it. There might be this dictatorial power of the ESM governors, but when the countries are asked to pay this money, there will be nothing which will be able to get the money out of these countries. So that's my question. Do you think that this whole ESM concept is just worse than it looks like because it's just giving a false illusion that there are some money in the eurozone, that they are there to save it? Thank you.
Maybe 2 more questions. Mr.
Dallara, can you even imagine or admit way beyond your either-or conclusion concerning Europe in terms either fiscal union or a disastering fragmentation in nationalistic terms? Can you even admit or imagine way beyond this either-or?
So there was one more, please.
My name is and I should say that there are some laws, some rules which are more strong than economical rules. Say biologists have such a rule that any biological species or communities disappear if they are not able to reproduce themselves. One of example of such phenomenon is population decay of West Europe and other parts of the world. My question is how this population decay will influence your conclusions. Thank you.
So it seems to me that it's time to return the microphone to Charles.
Thank you very much, Václav, and thank all of you for your very interesting and wide-ranging questions, and thank you for providing us no shortage for some areas of continued debate, Václav. Let me first tackle, if I may, a few of the questions, and then I'd like to respond to a few of your comments. First, I will say, in response to the question about whether or not other nations should step in to help the Spanish banks. And this is related as well to this question of the ESM or the ESFS. Now, obviously, I may have a lot of blind spots, but I know better than to enter into the middle of Czech politics, so I'm not commenting at all here on what what may or may not be the decisions which the President faces. But I do think that there is a case for harnessing some of the collective strengths of Europe to alleviate the burden on national budgetary environments and sovereign debts while these countries move to rebuild confidence in markets. We all know that sovereign debt is like a lot of other realities in life. It depends so much on confidence. Having debt on the balance sheet of a sovereign is not necessarily a problem. The greatest century in the history of the United Kingdom, when it developed its standing as one of the greatest countries in the world, was a century when it accumulated more and more debt. But it was growing. It maintained the confidence of investors. It structured its debt in a very sensible fashion. Right now, the Spanish economy is in a very negative phase. I don't think this means, however, that the Spanish economy is doomed forever. I think it means that it is not able to handle on the balance sheet of the sovereign right now the funds that are necessary to stabilize the Spanish banking system. And I think we all know that no economy can work without a stable and effectively functioning banking system. One of the first things you did here in the Czech Republic was privatize your banking system. Now you can debate whether or not it was a perfect process or not, but the fact is that you now have a strong and stable banking system here. I think the issue goes to whether or not Europe has the collective wherewithal to support individual countries. And I think there's more scope for that than might meet the eye. I do believe, yes, it is a matter, and I agree fully, Václav, with you that this comes down not just to politicians in Brussels, but it comes down to the willingness of citizens to engage in a broader process of sharing burdens as well as sharing benefits. But when you look at how much Europe has invested in the integration of Europe following World War II, and when you look at what the potential consequences of a renewed fragmentation of Europe may be, I think the case for European solidarity remains quite strong. And I think that you find that citizens may well surprise us. Now, I can't speak for any of you. I was surprised. Ireland has gone through a tougher time as anyone. Now, I'm not saying whether they were right or wrong to vote on the fiscal compact the way they did, but the fact that they were willing to support a referendum in support of fiscal discipline. Let's not talk about the particulars of the fiscal compact, because in isolation, it is not a terribly meaningful idea. But I think this demonstrates that as rough a time as the Irish people have had the last 4 years, and it's been rough, that they still are willing to invest in European solidarity. And I think there is a recognition that mutualizing the strength as well as, yes, some of the burdens of Europe, it can stand very tall and very strong in the global economic parameters alongside the United States and China and other major economic powers. A few other particular issues, and then perhaps I could come back to some of the initial comments you made. The issue of monetary policy, I find it very hard to be too concerned today about inflationary pressures. I think the world is on the verge of another global recession. And I think that if anything, the ECB has systematically erred on the side of caution when it came to supporting through liquidity and lower interest rates the economic activity of Europe, because monetary policy is only meaningful if it can transmit that policy through the credit mechanisms into the real economy. And today, the ECB may think it has relatively low interest rates, but try to get a loan in Italy or Spain today, or even France, you either will not get the loan or you will pay very high interest for it. So the ECB has to be perhaps somewhat more pragmatic, creative, and I think, if anything, err on the side of support for the economy as the European economy struggles mightily. A couple of other particular issues raised. Fascinating question about biology and population. Certainly, I touched upon this a little bit because clearly you see demographics working against economic prosperity of the next generations in many Western democracies, especially in Europe, but also in China, where they are about to become victims of their own one-child policy. And pretty soon, the demographics are going to turn in a very negative fashion in China because that one-child generation is now going to be called upon to support an increasingly elaborated life expectancy for Chinese, just as you're seeing in a somewhat less dramatic fashion, because Japan never had a one-child policy, but the tendency of the younger couples in Japan today is obviously moderate childbirth. And so for various political and cultural reasons, demographic and others, I think the current welfare obligations of governments are going to become increasingly unsustainable in light of the demographics which we see in the United States, Europe, and China. And I think underscoring the importance of taking a hatchet to many of these programs, which continue, I think, to discourage the kind of dynamic reallocation of economic resources, labor and capital mobility that you need to recreate the engines of growth. Coming back, if I may, to one final issue and then to a couple of comments. Of course I can imagine, sir, something other than a black and white, something other than just the extremes of a fiscal union or a collapse of the euro. But I think it's not a pleasant world. It is the muddled through world of stagnation which President Klause talked about. And I don't know how long it is sustainable. If Spain, just to put it in context, if Spain loses market access, there will need to be continued funding for the Spanish budget. The only place that will come, the current overall deficit of Spain is somewhere, what, 5.5%, Jeff? The only place this will come is either from Europe or the IMF. Now, I know that Europe collectively believes, and I heard this again in forceful terms last night in Germany, that we can solve our own problems. But maybe there's a case for some lines of credit to be extended by the IMF right now. I thought it was bizarre that the IMF pounded itself impressively on its chest last week to announce that they had mobilized $450 billion additional dollars for IMF war chest. When asked what they were going to do with the money, they have no clue. If it's used for any place other than Europe today, I have no idea why. No idea why. I think there is a collective interest in supporting other countries, and here's where perhaps I do disagree, Mr. President. I think it is in the interest of European citizens to stabilize and help support the reactivation of the Greek economy. Of course, you're absolutely right when you say job creation in Greece will not happen because of lecturing from Brussels or very supportive words from me or any combination thereof. But it can happen with privatization, with a dramatic downsizing of the state, with a liberalization of the product and labor markets there that are so sorely needed. This can create a more dynamic economy. I saw the economies of Latin America hopelessly burdened by the state, by the public sector owning and controlling and mismanaging everything in the 1980s, virtually everything. And they steadily worked to free themselves from the heavy burden of state management, state control, and state ownership, just as many countries did in this region of the world, to create much more dynamic, capable structures. I am not convinced that Greece is incapable of moving in the same direction. And therefore, it is a question, is it in the interest of other European citizens to support this process? Of course, I could be wrong, and it could be that the euro is a much more stable, invulnerable dynamism than the tapestries of Bayeux, but I doubt it. I doubt it. I think you start pulling threads and it unravels. And so if you're prepared to see the unraveling of the euro with Greece pushed into the Aegean, then of course, it's a risk that one has to contemplate. But the amount owed by Greece alone to the ECB is double the capital of the ECB. So overnight, the ECB is insolvent. The most stable, arguably the most competent, most respected institution in Europe is completely underwater. Not to mention the hundreds of billions of other claims which the eurozone, the EU, the ESFS, the IMF, and many other businesses have on Greek entities which will be washed out to sea. Does anyone really want to receive drachma? That's the only thing you're going to, drachma. Does anyone, you want to receive Greek drachma, which will depreciate and become an instrument of inflation? I don't know. I lived in Greece for 2 years. I do have a few drachmas still in my drawer.
To use the taxpayers' money for making nonsense help
Well, it may be. Maybe we should take a vote. But I just think that one has to recognize that there are times when economies merit support. I certainly understand that. The vision of Europe will never be a comparable vision based on the revolution and then evolution of the United States. But I can still see the underlying power of the European project, as so many call it, and the willingness of Europe to invest in it, because the alternative to me is pretty bleak. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. I'm surprised. No, nevertheless, first, you repeatedly use terms like Europe has invested since the Second World War in something. I totally disagree. Europe is not a decision maker. Europe is not an investor. Some European politicians wrongly invested in this European project. That's a fundamental difference. I'm trying to teach students that the countries are not investing, that continents are not investing, and you still unconsciously use the same phrase, which I think is basic. Second point, you repeat, and you are not alone in this respect, you repeat words like European citizens. Charles, you are misusing the American experience with the European experience. There are, by definition, no European citizens. By definition. This is a wrong term. There are inhabitants of Europe, but not citizens. There are citizens of Ireland, Greece, or Czech Republic, or Spain. Your favorite Spain now. Yeah. But there are no citizens of Europe. This is just the wishful thinking of creating citizenship in Europe. So there are no European citizens, and I myself don't feel any solidarity vis-à-vis Greece, Spain, Finland, I don't know who, the same solidarity as vis-à-vis Malaysia and Brazil. Definitely there is no higher degree of solidarity on my side. My third point. I remember that several years ago, as an innocent economist, I had problems with the term sovereign debt. Because in my understanding, it was just the debt of the state, It was a state debt, but in a newspeak. In a newspeak, I don't know whether it's the Washington newspeak or new version of an Orwellian newspeak, the sovereign debt crisis. Are Greece or Spain sovereigns? When they are sovereigns, there is no way to help them, and there's no reason to help them. They made, in that case, sovereign decision, and they should take costs of that decision till the final end. So why do you Washington economist, why do you use the term sovereign debt crisis? It's a misnomer. Again, it's a newspeak, totally wrong term, which is unnecessarily used. We are not speaking about sovereigns. We are speaking about non-sovereign countries, and that changes the whole perspective fully. And again, as an economist, I on the one hand agree that the growth, I quote you, growth will not come without investments and credits. But this is an empty statement, because the investments and credits come only in a moment when there are 100 conditions fulfilled, and the investments and credits can come. It can't be a decision of the Institute of International Finance, IMF, European Commission, or anyone else. It's simply investments and credits don't come. That's again in my I hope clear thinking. It's impossible to use those terms. And finally. You spoke about the obsessiveness in short-term budget cuts or something like that. We don't consider it obsessiveness. We think that this is the only rational and only possible and only meaningful and only allowed policy. And so that's a basic ideological or philosophical problem. So I don't think it's necessary to multiply the number of my remarks, because they would go in a circle. But that's at least the position of some of us here. We are also we are not happy with the European projects. We think that it was a wrong way to do it. We are very much in favor of openness, liberalization, economic integration, but we are not very much in favor of the current European project, and so on. So, but I don't think it's the topic of our. We have still one small comment, but we have almost to stop here.
It's working. Yeah, thank you very much. Definitely, I agree that the key task is to restore confidence in the market right now. But I definitely disagree that the way how to do it, really to enlarge and to use European funds for that, because I don't believe it's long-term sustainable solution. The only one way to put in place a real macroeconomic framework which works. And I'm not in favor of Greece, or not favor of Greek drachma, but I favor in devaluation, because this is the only way how to put long-run sustainable way to attract investors, to attract competitiveness of the economy. This is what I believe. I just wanted to point it out.
Perhaps just a few final comments, and then I'm sure we should not continue this debate forever. Just on this last comment, I think that let's talk about practical terms. Either the Spanish banks were stabilized by the Spanish government, the eurozone, or the IMF. Now, you can choose implicitly to stabilize them by the Spanish government, but in doing so, you take Spain out of the market and put a huge burden on the back of all citizens of European states. Maybe I said it more correctly that time, instead of European citizens. So that's the consequence of your suggestion, fine. As far as Greece is concerned, they have restored almost half of the competitiveness loss which was created during their most recent decade of inefficiency through dramatic compression of private sector wages over the last 4 years. If that is accompanied by major improvements in the structures of the Greek economy and serious adaptation of public sector wages, it is very feasible to restore competitiveness without returning to the drachma. My concern is what a period of hyperinflation will do to the Greek economy and what it will do to Europe as a whole, because I do not believe that it's likely that if Greece leaves, the remaining 16 remain intact. I just don't. It's a debatable point. You can believe that Greece alone is unique.